What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time excited to bring you some news about Pillars of Eternity 1 and its upcoming turn-based mode. As yesterday, from the time of this video, we finally got the date and a lot of details about it, but if you remember, all the way back in March of this year actually, they initially announced this was coming this year, and I had covered it back then, and obviously I've been excited for it since. So it's fun to actually get to talk about this because as one of the 15 people to have beat Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire's Ultimate, I think it's safe to say I'm pretty fond of the series. However, let's get the most important stuff out of the way first. The turn-based mode will be entering a public beta on November 5th, over on Steam in particular. This means that you'll be able to play it for yourself and potentially provide feedback before it goes into its final iteration. They also put out a trailer, technically, with Josh Scheuer explaining some of the main things this system was trying to do, and what I want to do with this video is take a lot of that information, elaborate on some of it, and then also, of course, talk about a few other things towards the end. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into this thing. First, I thought it was interesting to know that this was apparently primarily worked on by about 3 people. That is of interest to me simply because I was curious how many resources they were putting towards this, given that Pillars 1 is over 10 years old at this point. Otherwise, though, a lot of what they wanted to do with turn-based in Pillars 1 was address some of the difficulties that came with implementing turn-based into Deadfire. If you don't know, there was a fair few criticisms of the way turn-based is handled in that game, and so they wanted to take those into account with how they implemented it here, and that's some of the stuff I'm going to elaborate on as we go. But the first thing to know is how they've addressed things with, like, the action economy. So a problem with Deadfire's turn-based mode is that it didn't really take into account the fact that in the real-time with pause mode, the number of times your character could act were based on, like, the recovery times of the actions they took, but also their stats, like dexterity and things that would then add into, again, how many times they could act so often. That's not something Deadfire really handled in turn-based mode. It was just your turn based on the initiative order, pretty much. That's not the case here, but it's also not like one-to-one with the real-time with pause system either. But the gist of it is, the higher things like your speed stat, your dexterity, that stuff is, the more often that character will get a turn in turn-based mode, which is going to allow them to get closer to what the real-time with pause implementation of the system was. That sounds like a good change. Primarily things like dexterity. Because of how this stuff worked in Deadfire, like a stat like dexterity in turn-based mode was not particularly useful. Another thing they wanted to address here, which I thought was funny, they didn't explain too much about, they just said it was abusable. They put a limit on the free actions that you could take this time. So there were certain free actions that could potentially cause damage, things like that, and there weren't, because they were free, a limit on the amount of times you could use them, which could lead to you just spamming them to just like instantly kill things or just abuse the combat mechanics overall. Well, in this implementation for the first game, they're adding stuff to what is considered free actions, like swapping out your weapons, drinking potions, or toggleable abilities, but they're just actually putting a limit on them now. Every free action is limited to 1 per turn per type. So you can take more than 1 free action per turn as long as it's just for the type of action you are taking, which is going to rein in some of the abusable things you could do to that system. Now, probably one of the most important changes, though I think it's probably going to fly under the radar a little bit here, is actually the lethality and pacing of everything they're about to do for both enemies and your character. I'm curious how they're going to implement this. We don't actually have the specific details on that, but I imagine the gist of it is just that everything's going to deal more damage and potentially kill you much faster. Or you, the enemy, that kind of thing. But why make that change? Well, basically, both Pillars 1 and Deadfire were designed first and foremost as real-time with pause systems. And so when they added turn-based as an option to Deadfire, there were a lot of battles that were really drawn out because they were designed with a much faster combat pace in mind. So the idea behind the increased lethality for characters here is to make up for the fact that there's a lot of enemies and allow you to kill them much more quickly, which will hopefully increase the speed of these battles that were not 10 years ago designed with this combat mode in mind. And then last but not least, another exciting and important change to how this is going to work is the fact that you'll be able to turn it off. So in Deadfire, you have to pick real-time with pause or turn-based when you start a playthrough. And that is permanent for the rest of that playthrough. Here in Pillars 1, they're going to add this as a toggle. Right now, or at least at the time of the beta anyway, it's going to be in the menu options. It's not going to be something that you can like do with one click, but they are, however, looking into that. It's not set in stone, but they're hoping to add something to like the UI or whatnot that will let you just change it with one click, like we see in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous as an easy example. Excited for that. That being able to swap it out with one click was especially impactful for that game. And I think the ability to turn it on and off, which will help you, again, focus on like large fights with turn-based or let you handle like smaller fights with real-time with pause, really helps with the pacing of this type of thing. And I think this sounds great. So, tentatively, ahead of the beta for this, without having played it myself, it sounds like they took a lot of the criticisms of Deadfire's turn-based to heart and changed up some stuff accordingly. But this does beg a few questions, and I want to talk a little bit about those before we wrap up this video. So first and foremost, I think the obvious question is, will some of these changes, if they are well received, be making their way into the Deadfire version of turn-based? Because I would certainly hope so. Now, on one hand, that's easy to say, and when it comes to actually doing the thing, it might be much more difficult depending on like changes to the engine and how things work behind the scenes that I am not privy to. But if this goes well and everything works accordingly, I would really want especially that toggle for Deadfire added. Though, and just as a bit of a spoiler, since I initially reviewed Deadfire, which was one of my first reviews, come a long way in terms of like presentation and stuff, and also have completed the ultimate for that game since, I do plan on re-reviewing Deadfire at some point, hopefully like January, and it would be really cool if I could do it with a toggleable turn-based mode that I could turn off and on. So we'll see what happens. I don't have an answer to that, but just to throw it out there into the universe, I would hope those changes wind up making their way to Deadfire at some point, if Obsidian happens to find themselves taking requests, I suppose. Now, there's also the sort of inevitable side conversation that pops up when you see updates to really old games like this, which is, hey, are they working on like Pillars 3? Why are they doing this? And while I imagine I would probably be one of the single most excited people for a Pillars of Eternity 3, I have been barking up that tree forever, basically since 2 was made, I would not take any of this as a sign that that's coming. Realistically, as I said at the beginning, this was worked on by like 3 people. Deadfire's turn-based was worked on by, I think it was 2 as well. And I simply don't think that is indicative of them putting like extreme resources towards the Pillars franchise these days, especially after all the news about how Deadfire did sales-wise, taking a long time to turn a profit, that kind of thing. But having said that, I think if you really want to show Obsidian, as well as, let's be honest, Microsoft at this point, that a sequel to Pillars 2 is something that people really want, that it's something that could do well, then realistically the best thing you could do is to be loud about this. Play this beta, encourage other people to play the game generally, see how special they are, what 1 and Deadfire could do, and how investing into that franchise would be a worthwhile endeavor. Because while I've certainly been trying to show people how great this franchise is and the things it could offer with things like covering updates like these, completing the ultimate and, trying to generate some buzz around that, it's ultimately going to take a lot more than me. But hopes for the future aside, that's pretty much all there is to say on this one. Certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about all this down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.